All right, guys. So this week in our lesson, we are going to be talking about illustrating the Trinity. So illustrations for the the concept and the doctrine of the Trinity. And so these are the points that we're going to be going over today. We're going to be talking about kind of how attempting to use illustrations for the Trinity is always somewhat perilous, just because the Trinity is God. God is divine. There is nothing like him in this created world. So that means just simple, what's the right word? Kind of process of elimination. If there's nothing like God, well, then necessarily all illustrations will lack some comparative power. All of them will be necessarily imperfect. And so on account of that, we just need to be very, very careful that we don't place focus here on these, and we don't try to draw doctrinal conclusions off of it and things like that. And so actually this section in the study, it's not so much teaching, it's not so much trying to explain the Trinity in terms of these illustrations, as it is trying to show how these illustrations are sort of necessarily insufficient. And so we'll kind of see what that means a little bit more as we go on today. But we're going to start off with very early illustration. This comes up in the early church, the so-called Trinity triangle, which is just a visual representation of what we have already said, that the Father is God, Jesus is God, the Spirit is God, but the Father is not the Son or the Spirit. The Son is not the Father or the Spirit, and the Spirit is not the Father or the Son. So the is and is not relationships. Now we're going to talk about the family of man, so mankind, the human mind, illustrations from the world of nature. So this is like physical nature per se. Illustrations from the physical realm, like light, for example, or the universe. And then at the end, we're going to kind of come back and touch on this point that we started with, that basically, well, there you go. There are some of the illustrations that have been used across times and places in history to try to help explain the Trinity, and you shouldn't be very impressed, basically. That is, we're going to kind of end where we started on this. And not so much that we need to look down our noses at anyone who tries to say, well, just as God is three yet one, so too in this other area. Maybe it helps, right? But the point is, it's very dangerous to build doctrine on it. That's going to kind of be the fundamental point that we try to make today. All right, so the first point that we are going to be starting with in our discussion here of illustrations for the Trinity is the kind of initial caveat, the initial warning that I mentioned, going over how all of these illustrations are sort of going to be necessarily imperfect. And so we did kind of touch on this in our previous lesson here, that all attempts here to kind of illustrate such a doctrine as the Trinity, which is so core and central to our belief, just because of the importance of this, there is the potential there that this does more harm than good. So if your illustration is even a little bit off-center and people read into it more than they should, suddenly you might have harmed their understanding of the Trinity. And because of how important that is kind of a very bad thing. And so the fundamental problem with illustrations of kind of the type that we're going to be going over today is that if you take them too far, if you put too much stress upon them, you do run the real risk of leading to heretical conclusions. And it's not going to be so direct in as much as the second you look at one of these, suddenly your entire understanding of God is going to become overly complicated. You're not going to know heads from tails anymore. It's that basically, if you start reading into it, if you start trying to make the analogy fit, that's when you're going to run into problems. And so the basic idea here is that it's really more like we want to make sure that we don't do more harm than good, right? That do no harm principle that doctors sometimes try to abide by. That is the sort of idea that we are going to be going into this discussion with. And the fundamental problem, kind of mentioned this a little bit in the introduction there, was that the illustrations here are trying to illustrate a divine being using things from the created realm. And nothing in this creation is at all like God. We have talked about this previously in discussing God's essence. His uniqueness his sovereignty within the material universe, there's no one else like God. There is no other being, no other created thing that is at all like him. And that's in regard to his infinite nature and his perfect character, as we have gone over in the past here. And so that simply means, again, by the process of elimination here, that there is absolutely nothing that will serve as a good parallel, as a truly good analogy for God, is that all of these things will necessarily fall short. That doesn't mean that they're evil, it just means that they're insufficient. And there's kind of more to this even. Satan attacks the Trinity. He always has. Satan's always looking for ways to kind of interfere with our understanding of God's truth, and attacking the divinity of Jesus Christ, the divinity of any members of the Trinity, or just the teaching of the Trinity in general, the threefold sovereign personality of God and the deity of the three persons. All of these have always been kind of important attack vectors in Satan's plan, because if Satan can compromise someone on these issues, they're just a hop, skip, and a jump away from compromising on what makes us Christian. In fact, depending on exactly what we mean by compromise, getting people to stumble here already kind of messes with the core beliefs that we need to hold as Christians. And so the problem with all this is that this triune personality, this is exactly the point that illustrations of the Trinity miss. Like, they cannot in any way do this, right? And so it's a little bit subtle here, right? Rather than Satan coming right up to someone and being like, the Trinity is false. And then most Christians would be kind of, I guess, we'd be primed to look at someone and say, no, it isn't, because, and then, go into an explanation of how the Bible talks about it, like we've been talking about, right? We'd have a knee-jerk reaction to this. But when someone else instead says, the Trinity is like, and then presents some example, they're not so much attacking the Trinity head on as they are making this comparison. And see, this is why it's a little bit more subtle, because if they were attacking the Trinity head on, we would recognize it for the challenge to correct doctrine that such a thing would be. But when people instead give what I would call an imperfect comparison, maybe we give them the benefit of the doubt more, or we don't recognize it as being dangerous to our own understanding. But if we buy into it, it is still coloring our understanding of God. Because fundamentally, if the first things out of our mouth are not something along the lines of God is divine and outside of space-time and nothing is like him, therefore we basically, I'm trying to think about the right way to say this, you don't want to come off as hyper-legalistic either. The point needs to be nothing can truly compare to God. So we need to discuss this doctrine, what I would call theologically. We need to treat it without kid gloves, without trying to rationalize it as this thing that is fundamentally incomprehensible in some sense to us as finite humans. And we shouldn't apologize for that. That's just how it is. That's what it means for God to be an infinite being outside of space-time, while we are finite beings within space-time. Like, we're just never going to completely get it. And we need to make peace with that, rather than trying to explain it all away. So we need to always come into discussions when such a thing would come up with that being the starting point. And we shouldn't like shame people for it. We should just stand firm on the truth. And the point that I'm saying here is that the comparisons, due to the imperfection that is present in them, we need to recognize them as dangerous. We need to accept that if we actually look to them for teaching, they can mislead us. And that is just a kind of a different starting point than where some people may land on this thing. And that's why we're trying to make this point kind of more explicitly up front. Audie, do you have any thoughts? You want to jump off of anything I said?
Okay. So, yeah, I think that the bottom line is to keep in mind the danger of using any illustration. But as with pretty much anything else in the Bible, our job is to learn what the truth is. And for us who are teachers, our job is to teach. And sometimes to teach, you have to use imperfect analogies. I mean, Lord Jesus was always doing that in his parables. He would talk about things that weren't exactly the thing he was talking about, but there was something in those things that resonated with the realities of which he spoke. So, for example, he would say that the kingdom of God is like
mustard seed. How about?
a mustard seed, or I think the particular one I was interested in is a bit of leaven that you put in a loaf and it leavens the whole lump, something like that. And, you could push that really far and you'd have all sorts of problems with it. I mean, there are people today who are thinking, and probably not necessarily because of that, that analogy, that the kingdom of God is supposed to expand and keep expanding. And basically, they have this thing we call dominion theology, which is essentially that the world is going to get better and better, and the church will eventually consume it before the Lord Jesus will return. The Lord Jesus will return to a world that has turned to God, essentially. That's what some people would make of that. But in fact, what he was saying was a completely different thing, which was it might be small at the moment when he was talking about the population of people who actually were, walking with the Lord. There has always been a very small minority of people throughout the ages who have been walking with God. But what he was saying is that now there was going to be an explosion, and what was hitherto seemingly confined to Israel was going to spread throughout the entire world. That was what he was essentially saying. But of course, when you use that analogy, you have to accommodate the fact that that analogy is not the thing itself. We will need these analogies. We will need these illustrations just to wrap our minds around something that would otherwise be inconceivable to us. And the Lord has actually he built the world. He built this universe that we live in to tell us about himself. Now, that's a very important thing. Psalm 19 and Revelation and Romans 1 both attest to this, that the world in which we live tells us something about what and who God is. Of course, it doesn't give us the entire revelation. The revelation it gives is very limited, but for someone who loves the truth and wants to know about the Lord, you can use things in the world around you to appreciate and understand the Lord a bit more. And for someone whose job it is to communicate the truth about the Lord to others, you can use things in the world that people can relate to understand some more about the Lord. But we have to never forget that an analogy is no more than an analogy. And when you're comparing anything to God himself, that is a necessarily flawed comparison, because just as Stephen said, there is nothing in the universe that is quite like God. So we can only say in this way and in that way, this thing could throw some light on something about God, but we should not take the thing too far and come to think of it in ways that are inappropriate, that do not fit the revelation that we have of the Lord in the scriptures. So again, not demonizing using illustrations, but certainly being cautious and reserved in our use of them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I just used kind of a funny anecdote. I'm sure many folks are aware of kind of the parable of the sheep and the goats, right? Talking about the separation and last judgment. There is nothing inherently evil about one or the other, right? As if one sort of animal is like, on account of this physical characteristic or that physical characteristic. You see what I'm saying? Like, that is pushing the analogy quite a bit too far. It's just, the point is there will be a separation in the final judgment. I mean, a lot of this things you would think would be common sense of, no, that's just an analogy. It doesn't mean what you're saying it means, but people do go there. So, that is just why we have to head off that sort of thing. Now, I will say, just as perhaps giving a bit of intuition to why ought we be cautious in this? Like maybe you say, what's the harm? Maybe if it helps us. So we have touched on a little bit how basically giving too much ear here, it tries to what I would call like physicalize God too much. We try to fit him into a box that we can understand. But the thing is, you shouldn't put God in a box because he doesn't live in one, right? He's unbound. There's this interesting interplay. This was brought up by someone when we paused briefly for a sec. Also with the idea of no graven images. It's one of the 10 commandments here, right? What we do when we try to conceptualize God in a way that basically we have not been given leave to is we are trying to make an image of him. Maybe it's not as obvious as, I don't know, like making a statue and calling it God. But to the extent that we try to make him physical, we make him bounded in the sense that we can then feel like we actually understand him, we have actually taken God and reduced him to something he is not. And
Yes.
that's the severity of it, right? It is, you're breaking one of the commandments here. Like it's not like an shrug, who cares sort of thing. It's a, we need to respect God as we ought, as the omnipotent creator of the universe, who cannot be put into a physical box. You just can't. If you call a physical box like that God, you don't really understand. Well, not that we will ever perfectly understand who God is, but basically, whatever conception you think you have is just woefully insufficient, right?
Yeah.
And that's just why it's not legalism here. It's not legalism to say that we really got to be careful not to go too far. We really have to be careful what we say and what conclusions we draw. It's not just because we're trying to be pedantic or erudite or academic and look down our noses at people. It's because we do not want to get in the habit of trying to make God physical, trying to make him something that we can perfectly understand and metabolize, because that's not God. It's just not accurate. And the Bible itself weighs in against it. So we don't need to be super shy about it, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Yes. Correct.
So the first of the actual illustrations that we are going to be using here comes from the early church. It is attested in various places. And in many ways, this one is the safest of all illustrations you might use, because it's basically just a visual way to represent the information that we've already gone over. So I stole this picture off of Ictus. I did not make this picture. And it looks much the same no matter where you get it from. But if you see God in the middle of the triangle, well, the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God. But you can see here, based on these sides, like the sides of the triangle, the Father is not the Son, the Father is not the Spirit is not the Father there, the Spirit is not the Son, and then the Son is not the Spirit, and the Son is not the Father. So it just represents all of the relationships that kind of get to what three persons in one essence means. That is that all three members of the Trinity are God, but they are not each other by personality. So hence three persons, one essence. And so, as I say, this is sort of the safe illustration, because it is visually representing the points that we need to teach when we teach the Trinity, that they are all God and yet they are distinct from each other, and it just puts it in a picture, basically. So I'm a little bit, I don't know what's the right word. It's not that this isn't an illustration, because, well, it is kind of a visual representation of it, but I don't quite think of this in the same terms as I think of some of the rest of the things that we'll go over, and you'll see a little bit more what I mean by that in a moment. But I actually think this one is absolutely fine. I even think it's a good thing for us to bring up when we teach on this, just so that people can see it all in front of them. Maybe rather than reading 3 or 4 sentences, they just look at the picture and they say, that is what we mean when we say that the members of the Trinity are all God, but they're not each other. Audie, do you have thoughts on this initial one?
Yeah, my thought is exactly that. I wish I had your optimism about people. People are very interesting. There is a very popular symbol, so to speak, out there in media during the Illuminati madness that the entire world got engulfed in for a bit. That picture was very, very big. They had it's actually in your dollar bills. I don't know if it's just the $1 bill or the higher denominations, but there was a pyramid with an eye on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So exactly. So people get caught up in things like that, and you would be very surprised how people could make a triangle that's just explanatory. It's not even, there's nothing about it that should be special. They can turn it into something that it is not. The human heart is very idolatrous, incredibly idolatrous. And that's what we're warning about, really. We're saying the illustration is not the thing itself. The illustration is not the Trinity. The illustration is not God. So don't get it into your mind that, maybe because this is such a good representation of God, triangles are somehow mystical or divine.
Right.
Yeah.
Actually,
let's not go
I know
there.
Ichthus teaches about this other places, but you know how the Holy of Holies in the temple is this perfect cube? We
Yeah,
got
yeah.
more evidence for that than we do triangles, is what I'm saying. But even
Exactly.
that is like not, it's supposed to show the perfect equality of the three sides in physical space.
Yeah,
It's still just an illustration, right? There's no
yeah,
power to it. But
exactly.
just for example, another three-dimensional object that is mentioned in scripture doesn't mean that that is God, right? Or that cubes
Yeah,
are somehow holy and like,
exactly.
I don't know, trapezoids or what's a, I guess trapezoids are two-dimensional, not three-dimensional, aren't they? But whatever. You get the point that spheres are not holy because cubes are holy. You see what I'm saying? Like that, it's nonsense. But
Yeah. So
um,
we shouldn't get caught up in all of that is the point. It's just a very good illustration. It doesn't mean anything more than that.
yeah. All right. Well, I think that is mostly what we have to say on this one. This one has less potential to lead astray. I suppose, unless you get thinking that triangles are somehow godly. But as long as you avoid that, for the most part, you're not going to get off in
Yeah,
the
you should be
weeds
fine.
using this one. So, in terms of the first, what we might call actual analogy here, previously we'd just been talking about the Trinity triangle as a visual representation. Well, we're going to be talking about the illustration of the family of man, so of humanity or humankind here. So, like the Trinity, mankind has multiple members, all possessed of similar spiritual essences. But here's the difference. The Trinity shares a unique divine essence, and their triune unanimity of purpose is unlike anything in the realm of humanity. And so we are of a kind as humans. So my spiritual composition is like that of everyone else on this call, is like that of everyone else in the world, some 7 billion people over. But the thing is, we do not share an essence. So even though we are similar in how we are made up spiritually, we do not have a unity of purpose. We do not have a unity of agreement, assent, our plans. No matter how you slice it, two human beings, even identical twins who grew up in the same set of circumstances with the same parents, everything, and they share the same goals, they work at the same company, you can stack as many variables as you want. And those two human beings will still not at all be united in the way that gets us even close to how united the members of the Trinity are. And so hopefully you can see, in some senses, all of us are human, yet all of us are not the same, is kind of sort of like, there are three members of the Trinity, but they're all God, right? But the problem where this one falls apart is that they're not like, they don't all share, similar makeup and are yet somehow distinct. Because the problem with this analogy, in terms of some of the specific doctrine we've talked about previously, is that the whole concept of a pantheon of three gods would kind of work with this one too, right? But yet we know that is false and heretical. So in some ways, this analogy kind of gives us the wrong idea, right? Audie, you have anything you want to say?
Yeah, you're right. You're right. The fact that we human beings have certain qualities similar to the Trinity, or that we can talk about the fact that the Trinity is made up of different persons, just like mankind is made up of different persons, ultimately leads to, questions about why there are not three gods. I mean, there are so many different human beings, and we can say human beings. So if these are persons in their own right, individuals in their own right, and forgive me if I'm not exactly hitting on what you were saying, but when we see that disparity, or when we try to make that comparison, it does lead to that disparity. Human beings are distinct from each other, and not just distinct from each other, we're not bound in that unity that we find in the Trinity. So it leads people to eventually, when you start making those comparisons, it can lead someone to, getting the wrong idea of what the Trinity really is like. They may be made, the Trinity may be made up of three different individuals, three distinct individuals, just like humanity is made up of so many different individuals, but they share an essence, in a way that we human beings don't share an essence. So again, we can get lost just making that comparison, looking at things in that light. We should, beware of it. It's enough to say that the same way that I am a different person from Stephen, my thoughts are my thoughts, they're not Stephen's thoughts. The things I want to do may not be anything like what Stephen wants to do. This is how we understand our individualism. It is possible to carry that analogy too far and expect to find the same thing in the Trinity if they are necessarily distinct individuals. But no, what you will find in the Trinity is more along the lines of they share the same desires and whatnot. They are different individuals, distinct from each other, and yet there is no daylight between what the Father wants and what the Son wants and what the Spirit wants. There is no difference between the way they perceive reality. So the Father sees things the way the Son does and the way the Spirit does. That would be difficult for us to wrap our minds around, considering that human beings are not like that. No two human beings are exactly the same in their reasoning about anything, in their conceptions of reality, or in their aspirations in life. Yes,
I think you can get closer in some situations. So I know it's two people, not three, but if you think about the love and care that a mother and a father have for their child, like let's say it's about saving their child from certain harm, they'd probably be pretty united on that. But all it takes to see that one fall apart, so that's going from the family of man, writ large, to perhaps the family of man in a nuclear family. But when you think about disagreements parents have about how to raise their children, that unity goes out the window immediately, right? But you could sort of you can see flashes of it, right? Because the love and care that a mother and a father have for their child, it's not like the Trinity is exactly like that, but it is a more accurate reflection than some other analogies, right? It's closer. That's the unity, right? It's sort of a shadow of it, I would say.
Yes, but like you said, when you look at that, if we go, I like the way that someone actually put it on Clubhouse. He was saying to another person in a debate that the person was using anthropology to interpret theology, which is just wrong. God is not like man. You could say man is like God because a lot of our quality, a lot of what makes us human is based on what and who God is, right? So you could see how we're modeled after God, but God is not modeled after us. So we're going to find very quickly that a lot of things that might apply because of our individuality, because we are separate individuals from one another, things that apply to us don't apply to God in terms of his own individuality. So that's where we have to be very careful about the connections that we have with each other. But like you said, it is true that we can have things that look very similar to the unity that they have. A mother and a father having a child and wanting the best for their child, they want to raise their child right and all of that. They can synchronize in their thoughts through discussion and whatnot. But we should not think that because they can't do that, that the unity of the Trinity is similar to that the Father and Son and the Spirit sit down in a conference and try to marry their thoughts with each other and figure out how I basically reach some compromise over how things ought to be. It doesn't work.
You know what? Maybe the best way to say this, and hopefully this gets a chuckle out of people, is that the universe is not ruled by a committee. Let's put it like that, right?
Exactly.
That is the wrong way to think about it.
So the Trinity is not a comedy. It's certainly not. That's one thing we should keep in mind. Yeah.
So this is what we mean. And we'll kind of return to this point as we go through these, all of these illustrations. But I hope you can see how you can sort of see bits and flashes and shadows here of maybe kind of how we can see parallels. But it should be clear, I hope, that this cannot capture really who God is, what God is, because it's just not complete, right?
Yeah. The
And
information is not complete. That's just it. We don't have all of it.
yep.
Yeah. We can't handle it if it were. So there that goes.
Yep. So that is our first example here. So now we are going to be talking about the illustration of the human mind. So like the Trinity, the mind can be said to be at once one thing, yet at the same time several things, such as intellect, emotion, consciousness, and etc., and can dialogue with itself and even be at cross purposes with itself. But the Trinity is composed of distinct divine personalities to which the inner workings of our psyches make a poor comparison. Now, in this particular one, we as human beings, we are individuals. So we are made up of flesh and spirit, but if you ever read Galatians chapter 5, ought to be pretty clear that, the flesh and the spirit are polar, they're always at each other's throats. That's Galatians 5:17. They oppose one another. What unity, right? So even when you think about this, one tension that you will see come up quite a lot in what we might term philosophy, it's a theme in literary writing, is what we might term intellect and logic versus emotion, right? Unfortunately, sometimes this tends to get stereotyped across gender lines more than is probably appropriate, i.e. men are not always terribly logical and women are not always terribly emotional to the point that it interferes with logic. But this tension there does exist within us as humans. And, we know as Christians that we ought not let our emotions lead. And, at the same time, we know that, certain things that might seem on the surface to be logical are in fact great evil, right? So eugenics, for example, we're only going to let the really smart people reproduce. Does not lead to ideal utopias, right? That is a very immoral sort of thing to believe in. And so that's what we mean here by the human mind. We are composed of these multiple elements. In as much as, I don't know, psychologists and stuff name certain aspects of what they call the human psyche, all of them together, they don't have a unity of purpose. And I would say of illustrations, this one, I think, sort of self-evidently, how do you even identify the people in play here, shall we say? Intellect and emotion, I just gave a couple examples of kind of the two sides of the road, both leading to a ditch when it comes to that. But conscience, for example, all of these other things that compete, desire, perhaps, would be another one, or will, or, philosophers have all sorts of names for philosophy of mind type concepts. But, do you want to go on anything else before I say anything more?
Like you said, the human mind is a composition of multiple things. All of us have feelings. We experience emotion. All of us also experience thought. And we know it as a separate thing from feeling, because you might not feel you might not have much in the way of feeling when you are trying to make some mathematical computation of something. You're thinking when you're doing that, and sometimes you have to make a lot of dispassionate decisions where your emotions don't really come into play. But we know that when you have feelings and emotions, they're still, qualities of the mind that you express. And then when you have to weigh moral situations, that's still something that your mind, does. So all of these things are aspects of our, like you said, psyche. That in that same way, we can say that the Trinity is multiple people, but one, just like the mind is one. You don't think of your emotions and your thoughts as maybe being from different sources. Like, it's not your mind. One is your mind and the other is something else. We talked about the mind and the heart. That's poetical and whatnot, but we do know that whether you're talking about the mind or the heart, we're talking about something, the seat of human being, the person of the human being. This is where all of this stuff goes on. Our moral judgment, our thinking, our intellect, our feeling, and whatever else happens in this place. It's all one thing happening in one place, right? So we get that all of this somehow speaks to what the Trinity is like. The Trinity is multiple people, multiple persons, but also one. It's one. It's not a divided thing because it's multiple persons. But of course, the analogy breaks down when you see that, in fact, your intellect and your emotions are not always aligned. I mean, you can be, for example, in love with the wrong person, and you know it's the wrong person because all you have to do is think about it for a second. Someone who is absolutely wrong for you in every sense of that word, and yet your emotions go like, I don't care. That's the person I want. End of story. You're going to die from this, but yeah, so what? I still want it. That happens. And then your moral judgment, I think everybody knows this one. You know that your moral judgment is telling you this is just not the thing for you to do. It's just wrong on all levels. And you're like, yeah, but I still want it. And you can actually set your intellect against your moral judgment. So when you consider this is still one mind, the human mind, where all of this conflict is occurring. So even though it's one thing that has multiple expressions, if you will, or multiple aspects to it, it's still in conflict. A thing that is not the case with the Trinity. There is never any conflict in the Trinity.
Even though contrast, I think a good word to use here is peace, right? We understand that the only way we get peace is through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit when we submit to God. But it's like a sharp contrast, right? Our minds are fundamentally, without God, are not at peace. Like we literally call it the battlefield of the heart. So tell me, people who use this analogy, do you want to say that the members of the Trinity are at war with each other? You can see I'm being somewhat facetious here, but like, this is, again, it's like, well, if we can't say that, then what use is the analogy, right? Past a certain point. It isn't, because it's not descriptive of God. It doesn't work. And so, yeah, there's multiple things that are at the same time distinct, yet one, but not like the Trinity is. So, and we're gonna harp on that over and over again as we go through these, just because that is the core point here, is that you can see bits and flashes, but it doesn't completely work.
Yeah, that's the point.
Next, we're going to look at illustrations from the world of nature. So we're not talking so much about the physical universe in terms of what we might call natural laws and phenomena here, as we are talking about, like, I don't know, think like forests, trees, waterfalls, that sort of thing. So there's many things in the natural world that consist of distinct multiple parts that at the same time constitute one complete whole. So distinguishable branches, roots, and trunk are all part of one and the same tree, for example. And here's a pretty famous analogy. Eggs have three distinct parts: yolk, white, and shell. Without any which of the three, you would no longer have an egg. None of these illustrations really help to explain the unique personalities of the Trinity or shared divine essence. So what we might say by that is that, if we were to say that yolk is egg and white is egg and shell is egg, it kind of doesn't work perfectly, because technically speaking, the yolk is only like 1 out of 3 parts of the egg, right? And so I don't know how far you want to push that. So you say, is God God if he's not triune? I mean, like, what is the essence of deity? But where I'm going with this is that even if you accept, okay, you know what, these things at least get to that idea of multiple components, each making up one whole, it says absolutely nothing about the persons in the Trinity, right? So just not to put too fine a point on it, but if you say God is like eggs, people are going to look at you and be like, what do you mean? Like, you see what I'm saying? Because like, that particular statement is not what I would call didactically helpful, right? If you say God is like an egg, and you say it as though it means something grand, someone's going to ask you, but Mr. Teacher, sir, what am I supposed to get out of that? And see, that's the problem here, because the second is now you have to start explaining divine personalities. Eggs don't have divine personalities, right? Eggs don't have any personalities at all, because eggs are immaterial objects. It just like it's not. I should say that some of the other things we've been talking about, I think actually can really they don't fit because of what we might call serious comparison problems. Like the mind that we were just talking about, the battlefield of the heart, is really, really different from the unity that the members of the Trinity share. These aren't so much really, really different as it's kind of like trying to explain something with an analogy that doesn't really work, So I don't know if you've ever had a coworker or a friend or something, they're like telling a story, or they're trying to use an example, and they just like pick a really bad example so that whatever they're trying to explain just doesn't follow from it. This happened to me before, or they just or in an argument, someone is making an argument and they pick something to support their evidence that just does not follow, right? So today is Tuesday, therefore it will rain. Those two things are causally unrelated. It doesn't make sense, right? And to me, that is closer to what this is than anything else. Is that not so much that these things are they're not going to give you the wrong idea so much as that you just don't get any idea at all, because they're just not the same. Eggs. To be very clear, eggs are not like human beings either, because eggs are immaterial objects. They don't have personality or will, right?
Yeah.
It's non-living things, and it's just not the same.
So how the analogy might help when we're talking about eggs, for example, is still speaking to the fact that God is one, So it's not the best analogy, but you can see how something that has multiple parts is still one. It's not multiple things. It's one thing. But of course, where the analogy breaks down, as all analogies break down, I mean, anyone who has written anything in this world would say that it's a very common thing. All analogies break down. So this is not one of the best possible analogies you could make, but it still points to one thing where you have multiple things, and those multiple things are one thing. Now, the analogy breaks down in that neither of them is really the complete egg. So if you were to remove the yolk, is the yolk the egg? Well, the yolk is part of an egg. Without the yolk, do you really have an egg? The white, without the white, do you really have an egg? Without the shell, well, do you really have an egg? All of these things together, speak to the egg. The egg is all these things and none of these things, but then that's where the analogy breaks down. The Father is God, the Spirit is God, the Son is God. They're all individually God. They're not parts of God. So clearly, the analogy here breaks down in that the yolk is not the egg, but without the yolk, you don't have an egg. So
I'm not even sure I would go so far as to dive into the specifics here.
Yeah,
in terms of what we might term ontology, just because when you do that, you're kind of already going down this path of philosophizing the egg into a being with what we would call ousia. That's the Greek word for being. It's just they're, like I said, it's two things of a different class. So it's like if you're playing 20 questions with someone and you say mineral, but you're thinking of a carrot, right? It's not.
Yes.
I'm just saying that they're not two things of a kind, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
They're not even close.
There's a point I've been wanting to make for a little bit, but I kept forgetting it. It was essentially this, that when we are making these analogies, I hope I haven't forgotten it again. When we're making these analogies, when we're talking about these things, the goal is to show us what we have talked about once, that even though a lot of things about God are supralogical in the sense that they are beyond our ability to reason, they're not illogical in that they don't even, fit into what makes sense, so to speak. They do make sense, but the thing is, we don't have enough information to fully comprehend it, to fully understand it. So, besides, we don't have the ability to even understand that information if we had it. So, likewise, the argument that one could make with respect to any analogy we're making is, it's not out of place to conceive of something like the Trinity. It's not an illogical concept. It's just not one we can fully grasp. Because when you look into our experience as human beings, limited by time and space and a mortal body, we can see things in our experience that say, oh, something like this is possible, even though clearly it is not this. So we can say this thing we're talking about is not beyond the limit of possibility. It's not one of those things that are absurd. It's just too much to fully comprehend.
Well, so that it doesn't derive a logical contradiction, perhaps a way to put it.
Exactly.
And I would say that the problem is if you word things a certain way, that's where people run into trouble. They say God is one, yet God is three. But what do they mean by God is one, and what do they mean by God is three? Because that's why you can't omit the persons and the essence from the definition of the Trinity. Because if you say God is one, yet God is three, that's the definition of the Trinity. You've omitted the crucial information that the teaching of the Trinity is that God is one in essence and three in person. And you can't leave those things out, because otherwise, like what you're saying, well, it depends what you mean, right? Because that statement, actually, one does not equal three in terms of numerical logic, for example. But that's not what we're claiming, is the thing. We're not claiming that God is one person and three people. That is the equivalency that would derive a logical contradiction, right?
Yes, exactly.
The two things are not the same. We're not talking about the same thing on two sides of an equation, right? We're not talking about God has one essence, yet God has three essences, or God is one person, yet God is three people. We are saying neither of those things. We are saying that God has one essence, but he is three persons. See what I'm saying? And therefore, there is no logical contradiction, not inherent in logic. It's just hard to understand. That's all. Because there is nothing else that is multiple persons from the same essence in all of existence. Right? Yeah. That's all, that's literally all there is to it. But Audie's point is very important, and we should emphasize that, re-emphasize it. The Trinity is not an illogical doctrine. It is just outside the scope of human experience and understanding, because we are finite beings who don't really understand what an eternal existence is, much less eternal unity of will, things like this. We just kind of can't sink our fingers into it past a certain point because it's outside the scope of our experience. But that's very different from it being illogical in a formal logic sense. All right, so the next type of illustration we're going to be talking about here that people sometimes use in discussing the Trinity is the illustrations coming from the physical realm. So this category of illustration for the Trinity contains some of the perhaps more interesting examples that have ever been used when people have tried to map things from the material universe onto the Trinity to help us kind of understand it, contextualize it in material terms. But they all suffer from the same objections that were lodged against the former category. That is, when we were talking about things from nature, like an egg, which has the yolk, the white, and the shell, for example, any of which three you would no longer have an egg. But the problem with this sort, like we had said, was that none of these illustrations really help explain the personalities of the Trinity. Because while it is true that without any of those three things, you no longer have an egg, which is good, because that's true of the Trinity as well. If you don't have Jesus, it's not the Trinity. If you don't have the Father, it's not the Trinity. If you don't have the Son, it's not the Trinity. But, an egg yolk doesn't have personality. So it's limited in its power to describe exactly how the Trinity works. And like we said, this is just true across the board for all of our illustrations, because none of them can properly capture, the divine being of God who's external to space-time. They just can't. So these illustrations here, unlike nature, where the egg was one of the examples we used, we have several examples here. So maybe starting out with an easy one, light is one yet distinct. And we might also compare actually God being light, coming from 1 John chapter 1 verse 5, that God is light and in him there is no darkness. So God is actually described as being light, but you don't want to push this one too far in saying that. So when we say that light is one yet distinct, we're primarily talking about wavelengths here. So if anyone remembers back to their physics class, we know that radio is, electromagnetic radiation of a specific wavelength on the spectrum. Radio is heard, or, well, I mean, we don't hear it with our ears, but, equipment can take the radio waves and convert them into sound, because sound waves are a different type of wave than electromagnetic. But radio is heard, visible light is seen. So you might think across the rainbow spectrum, so red light on one end and blue light on the other actually have different wavelengths. So unless I believe, I'd have to actually go look, but I think red wavelength is like a longer wavelength and blue is shorter wavelength. Maybe blue's higher frequency. I don't remember. Blue light has more energy. I remember that from physics. But infrared is another type of electromagnetic radiation. So all of these things we can call light, yet no one of them has like a monopoly on light, right? They're all equally light, yet they're not the same. Like they're not equivalent to each other, right? So that's in the same way, this is where the analogy part comes in. The Father is God and the Spirit is God and the Son is God, but they are not each other. So in the same way that radio is light, visible light is light, and infrared is light, or electromagnetic radiation if you prefer, but all of those things are not each other. So just more examples here. We say the universe is one yet distinct, in that the universe is composed of time, space, and matter, and all of those things are the universe, but time is not space, and space is not matter, and matter is not time, right? Time is one yet distinct, past, present, and future, and all of those things are time, yet past is not present, and present is not future, and future is not past. Same thing with space, length, breadth, and height. All of those things are dimensions within space, but length is not breadth, and breadth is not height, and height is not length, and also with matter itself. So this one, I don't know. Again, physics, or if you recall in your heads, there's a very famous equation from Einstein, E equals mc squared, right? You might remember this. So energy and matter are related to each other in terms of the physical universe. And I misspelled that word there. That should be phenomena, not phenomena. That's not a word, phenomena. So matter is one yet distinct, energy, matter, and phenomena, and energy is not matter, matter's not phenomena, and phenomena is not energy. There's three things, right? All of these examples here, they get at this sense that the Father and the Son and the Spirit are all God, but yet they're not each other. But just like we talked about before with nature, the problem is that none of these things are personal. They're not individuals. Like, it's not like time, space, and matter have personalities in the same way that the members of the Trinity do. Again, they don't have personalities in the sense that we humans have personalities, but they have a will. They are persons. And so that's where these analogies kind of fall down, just like the past ones we've talked about. Audie, you have anything you want to contribute in this discussion here?
Okay, not much really. I think you have covered the grounds. Like we've said before, that all illustrations that we make about the Trinity are necessarily going to be flawed. They're all illustrations. They cannot be anything other than illustrations. So in some way, they will give some insight into how the Trinity works, but beyond that, we will find that those illustrations, like every other analogy, will break down. So that is what we need to know. But like we said, they're very useful to understand some aspect or other of the Trinity. I don't think there is much more to say or do regarding how the whole thing works. But you have covered it pretty nicely.
All right, so before we get back to the outline to kind of go over all that we've talked about, we're just going to close out kind of ending where we started, talking about basically some of the caveats to bear in mind when we are discussing these illustrations for the Trinity and kind of just the concept in general of coming up with these analogies to try to help us understand. So the most that can be said for the best of these illustrations is to the extent that they remind us of the awesome wisdom and power of God in creating all of these things that we're talking about. And we may often take this for granted as we go through life, just thinking about the enormity of the universe and the magnificence of God's creation. We probably ought to ponder that a little bit more, just generally speaking. However, all of those things, in as much as they may help us realize that God is going to be even greater than what he has made, that's a positive thing. They can help point us to him. This is, in fact, very much what natural revelation generally is, as talked about in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 and following, or Psalm chapter 19. We know God. We know certain aspects about his character and his divinity through that which has been made. And so, in as much as these things point us to God, and we know we can infer things based upon that just through the natural world and some of these created things. We talked about nature here and just things from the physical realm, creation generally. Well, these things can be good in as much as they point us to God as the creator. And so they may help us realize that God is going to be even bigger, even more complex, even more wonderful than the things that he has created. And so if they help us accept what we already know to be true about the Trinity, and again, as we have kind of hammered home time and again, the doctrine of the Trinity is basically one in essence, three in person, or one in essence, whichever order you prefer. Those things together compose the teaching of what we say we believe. And so if these things help us grasp that or accept it more easily, what we know to be true from what the Bible tells us, then okay, that's fine, right? Basically, this is best case, right? And so we're never going to completely grasp this. We've been over this before too. Even if it seems too complex and wonderful for us to fully grasp as humans, that's a limitation of our flesh, of our earthly perspective, given that we are very finite beings in space-time. On the other side, we will know more as we are known, the terminology the Bible uses. But nonetheless, right now, we have this very limited perspective that we are going to be kind of stuck with until we join God and Jesus on the other side and all of our brothers and sisters who've gone before us. However, and again, that was best case scenario. However, you can run into problems here as well. We have to take care that none of these illustrations are taken too far. We have kind of been over this before when you think about the interpretation of parables. So you have the parable of the wheat and the tares. Well, we are not actually literally wheat. You cannot take certain physical properties of wheat and start making suppositions and hypotheses based on them. And that's sort of the same thing here. And the idea is basically, if we go beyond what is written, we can be led to dangerous and extra-biblical rationalization based upon analogies. We cannot reason about the nature of God based upon characteristics of eggs. Just to go back to the nature example, God is not an egg, right? In as much as we use the egg to try to explain how there are these three parts, any one of which, if you take it away, is no longer an egg. If we try to use that to help us understand the Trinity, maybe, like we said, best case, maybe it helps us appreciate the complexity and the majesty of God. But you can't, go start trying to put God in a box based on characteristics of eggs. That's kind of what we're getting at here. And the Trinity here, this is kind of taking a step back into the wider context. The Trinity is very often a good litmus test for our Christian faith, because to accept the Trinity, you have to accept not only the existence of God, but also the distinctiveness and divinity of Jesus Christ. That is, he's a different person than the Father, but he is also God. And that's kind of the true touchstone principle that divides us as believers from unbelievers, that Jesus, fully God yet fully man, came down into the world paid for our sins upon the cross that we might have redemption and forgiveness through his blood. That's the essence of the gospel message. And so this is why Satan spends so many resources attacking this doctrine in particular, is because by distorting our understanding of the Trinity, the devil ultimately seeks to destroy our faith in Jesus Christ. Specifically, we would say who he is, the who he is part of Jesus Christ. But our entire understanding of redemption, of how Jesus paid for our sin, it doesn't work if he wasn't God. And this is why this is so, so, so important for us as Christians, because the divinity of Jesus and how he was God is God, and yet he took on a human nature to become the perfect sacrifice for our sins. It's as foundational as you get in Christianity, basically. And so that's why Satan spends time attacking this. And again, this is just why, well, by way of warning, we are saying we have to be careful not to go beyond what is written, not to push analogies. And by the way, these have going against them that most of these aren't even biblical analogies. They're just analogies people have come up with, which, in as much as they're not even in the Bible, they're not even inspired. We just have plenty of danger in going too far with this. That doesn't mean that you will inherently, the second you look at one of these that, that you're going to mess up your understanding of the Trinity. It's just we have to be really careful. And one of the other reasons why we need to take such care is just because of how critical and how important this doctrine is generally for our faith and practice as Christians. So that's kind of where we're going to leave off here. Just all of this should help point us to, okay, so maybe if some of these things aren't the best way for us to understand. So we've talked about three persons, one essence. Well, what does that mean? How does that work in how God interacts with creation? It's kind of where we're going to turn next. But this was just an introduction to the fact that we can use certain phenomena in the physical realm to try to help us wrap our heads around how this works and things like that. And it's not necessarily bad, but we just really need to be careful when we do it so that we don't get tripped up. Do you have anything else you want to share before we close out this section of the study?
Not really. I don't think there is much else to say. It does bear repeating and emphasizing that every bit of the Bible is important, and some parts of the Bible are, like you said, foundational to our faith. You don't need to understand the mechanics of the Trinity to be saved, but if you don't understand the Trinity and how it works, there's a chance that you have a greater potential to have your faith threatened than if you did. Because just as Stephen very aptly pointed out, the business of the Trinity, the truth of the Trinity, affirms the who part of the whole business of Jesus. Who is he, and what did he do? What did he do is what saved us, but who he is what made what he did possible. So if we don't get the who part, then that's where we're weak. That's where Satan is going to attack. And we have seen it has been a potent attack in the history of the church, visible for a long time. So getting it right is not an academic thing. It's not a hobby thing. We don't do it just for fun. We do it in order to make sure that there are no gaps in our faith, in our understanding of the Lord. There are no chinks in our armor. That's what we do it for. It's not just an academic endeavor.
Mm-hmm. So that's where we're going to cut this section in the study here. Just briefly going to go back over the things we've talked about here in discussing illustrations for the Trinity. We opened up talking about how, there are some perils, there's some risks here, especially if we're not careful in keeping these things contextualized, making it very clear that, this isn't, the formal teaching about God. At best, these are just ways to help us better conceptualize him, to put him in a human frame of reference so that maybe we can wrap our heads about how three can be one and one can be three in terms of three persons, one essence, or one essence, three persons. But we just have to be really careful when we do this, that we don't get lost in translation. And so then after that, we talked about the Trinity triangle, this illustration that has been around since the very early church, and how really calling this an illustration is maybe not quite the same as some of the other ones, because it's just sort of a pictorial and image way to represent the doctrine of the Trinity, which is that the Father and the Son and the Spirit are all God, but the Father is not the Son, and the Son is not the Spirit, and the Spirit is not the Father, right? And you can see those relationships represented here in the triangle. And so that early illustration, we said, if you keep it to the picture, there's nothing special about triangles, for example, but, it can be helpful in just showing us in a visual representation of what the doctrine of the Trinity is. Then we talked about the illustration of the family of man, the illustration of the human mind, illustrations from the world of nature, like that example of the egg, and illustrations from the physical realm, like light, the electromagnetic radiation, the spectrum there with different wavelengths, but they're all light, and space and time and matter and so on. All of these things can help kind of maybe help us get some intuition for how can three things be one? How can they all be the same yet different? And in the same way that the three members of the Trinity are all God, yet they are distinct persons. That's kind of where these analogies, these illustrations are trying to help us go. But again, we kind of closed out here just saying that because of how important this doctrine is, because none of these illustrations are really in the Bible either, we just have to be careful that we don't take any of this too far. That if we do any of this, which we're kind of going to argue in the next part of the study, that the best way to actually understand the Trinity is to look at how the Trinity operates in creation as recorded for us in the Bible. That's the best way for us to understand how this works in practice, probably more than trying to reason with these illustrations or analogies. So that's kind of where we're going to be turning now. We are going to be turning to the roles of the Trinity as discussed in the Bible. So there's a future section that's going to kind of hit more of the Old Testament specifically, or talk about the concept of Christophanies some. But right now, we're just going to be introducing the roles in the Trinity, generally speaking. So we're going to be talking about the Father and the Son and the Spirit, and the names for God as it's involved in the roles in the Trinity. So that's what the next lesson will be going over.